Hello everyone, and today I'm going to be showing you how to get into soldering and just some basic tips for soldering, basic do's and don'ts and things that are going to make your life a lot easier. So the first thing is to buy a decent soldering iron. Preferably something 60 watts or over is what you're looking for. Usually the 30 watt ones or 25 watt ones are just terrible. They only melt certain types of solder and they just generally do a lot worse job than the slightly better ones. Also, you're going to want to get yourself some decent solder. I would recommend 60-40 for most jobs, and usually the finer the better to a point. You don't want it like super fine, but just fine enough that it's not, too thick and you're going to end up dumping too much solder on. So first thing you're going to want to do, I'm just going to use an example of wires. So I like to, when I'm soldering things to capacitors or something like this, you can just tin the wire. If you're going to tin the wire and just solder it straight on, you're probably going to want to leave it a little bit shorter. This one is quite long, as you can see. But there's another thing you can do. What I like to do is strip the wire so that there's a lot of wire exposed, and then wrap the wire all the way around the terminal. This depends on how thick the terminal of the capacitor is. Then you just go ahead and solder it together. Tip is you don't want to be melting the solder onto the spot. You're going to want to put the soldering iron onto the wires and the terminals, and you're just going to want to leave it there for a little while. Not too long, obviously you don't want to burn the components, but you really want to heat the wires up. It should be hot enough that when you touch the solder to the wires and not to the soldering iron, it should melt the wires. As you can see, it's sort of starting to melt. It's not quite hot enough yet. And then we're going to go ahead and we're just touching the terminals, not the actual soldering iron itself. If you melt the solder onto the soldering iron first and then try to apply it, quite often it won't stick properly and you'll just get a terrible solder. And as you can see here, we've got a fairly decent attachment here, and then you can just go and snip any extra terminal length or wire length. Another important thing for when soldering is you'll notice that after a while of just soldering, the flux tends to build up and other junk sort of builds up on the tip here. Usually, as you can see, I don't know if you can see it that well, but it's pretty dirty and looks pretty bad. One of the things you can do is just sort of use sandpaper to scratch off the basic stuff here. You could alternatively also use a file. You want to be pretty quick when you're using the sandpaper because it will burn your sandpaper if you're not careful. But if you just quickly swipe it a few times, that'll get it roughly clean. It's not the best way. You can use a file alternatively to get it a lot cleaner, but it does eat away at a bit of the material on the tip. The even better option would be to soak the tip in an acid bath. So you just get some fairly strong, like really strong acid, and then dunk it in there and it'll clean it. Probably while it's turned on it'll sort of evaporate it a bit, but it should be fine. And if it's really dirty, it's going to make it super difficult to solder things. It'll still heat wires up in that, but it'll make tinning wires a lot harder in that. The next thing is for when you're not wrapping the wire around a terminal and you're just doing a regular soldering job. So I like to, you don't want to strip too much wire off, or too much of the coating off the wire with the strippers. So I just go ahead and cut like a little bit. I usually cut a little bit too much, so I can then snip it down once it's already been tinned. And I'm just gonna, for example, strip both ends here and solder the wire to itself. But when you're soldering or tinning wires in preparation for soldering them to something, or even just tinning general components, it pays to sort of heat up the wire. As I was saying before, you just want to leave the wire on the soldering iron for a while so that it heats up. And ideally, and also one other tip, you're probably going to want to grab the wires and twist them together. If they're all over the place, then it's going to make an absolute mess. So not to mention that, but you twist it together. Then you're going to want to heat up the wire with the soldering iron. And then once the wire's sort of absorbed quite a bit of the heat, then you'll start to push the solder on. You can push the solder into the soldering iron if the wire's already warm. You don't want to be just melting globs of solder onto the wire without the wire being hot, otherwise it won't receive the solder as well. You also don't want to hold it on too long, otherwise you'll get what I've just demonstrated here, which is the plastic insulation or whatever insulation you've got around the wire will bubble up and get all deformed and it doesn't look too good. Then we go ahead and do it for our second wire or component or whatever we're soldering to. As you can see, I'll just demonstrate what happens if you try and dump solder onto the wire. So if I would get solder on my wire here, on my soldering iron, sorry, and then try to just dump it on the wire, it may look like it's tinned, but it's really badly tinned and it's not going to stick. You're going to have lots of problems later on. So I'm just going to heat the wire up and then go ahead and push some solder into here, and hopefully the wire will soak up some of that solder. If you're using a wire that has really easily meltable insulation like this wire here, you might even be able to get away with using a lower wattage soldering iron, like 30 to 40 watts probably. Or you might want to use that just to stop melting. Also, if you're dealing with really fine components that can take heat damage, you'd also want to do that. And then once you've tinned both of the wires, I'd recommend getting a pair of these helping hand clipper things, and they'll hold onto the wire for you so that you can have an extra pair of hands. Then you would, you normally wouldn't do this, you'd normally get the wire and slowly push the solder in, but I'm just going to do this, and you heat up both the wires with a little bit of solder on your soldering iron. Ideally you would have another pair of helping hands that would clip the two wires so that they're held together, and then you would push the solder in. This isn't going to do a very good connection, but anyway, thanks for watching and have a nice day. Goodbye.